So the first question I will ask, there's a very general one at the beginning from Jamie, I'll keep that for the end, is one from Andrew Johnston, who is talking about personalism. And he's saying that these ideas were evidently influential on South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem in the 50s. So was the influence of personalism also true of other French anti-colonial nationalist movements?
Thank you for this question. It's really, really interesting because, but first, I think that many anti-colonialists from Quebec endorse the idea of personalism. And one of the things that I don't put on my slide here is a document called a Human Rights Charter for Free Quebec, published in 1963 by Michel Chartrand and others. And in the discussion about this document, they really kind of make comparisons with other part of the world, and they say that human rights is also a way to fight against the abuse of human rights made by colonial power. But in the 50s, what I see here is there's the connection between anti-colonial struggles in Quebec are not really present, at least maybe in some circles of the student movement. But what is sure is that if you take the International Confederation of Christian Unions, they will be really active in the 50s, 56, 57 in Africa and Latin America, and also in Asia. And I think, yeah, and what is, I will finish by this, I think personalists have problem with the question of nation, because in the word of Jacques Maritain, he says, okay, nation is kind of a trampoline to go to the universalism. So I know that in many debates on personalist groups, the question of the nation versus universality was really hard to manage. And I think one of the ways to manage it is to state that human rights is also a way to affirm national rights or self-power of nations. But yeah, there's probably a huge study about personalism and colonialism to do, yeah.
Okay, the second question is from Laura Madokoro. She's taking an invitation to discuss gender in the question and answer, and asking how the Catholic influence that you discussed might have shaped the gendered nature of human rights discussion in Quebec, especially before 1960.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for this question, but I would try to answer it in kind of 1 or 2 minutes. One of the crucial notion in personalism is the way that individuals are not only atoms and that they're also members of what they call a natural groupement naturel. And the first of this group is the family. So in all the documents of the CTCC until 1960, they state the right to family. And in the beginning of the 50s, right to family was also built around the notion of paternal authority, which was in the civil code in Quebec. And for example, when they asked for what they call the vital salary of the worker's family, one of the goal of this was to keep women in the house. So, and there was a women committee in the CTCC in 1943, 44, I think, 54, sorry. And they always ambivalent about all this. And I think that, yeah, in Catholic, that's one of the major kind of conservative part of their struggles. But in 1956, they kind of addressed the question of the place of women in unionism. And but even if you go in 1967 with the Byrd Commission, they are really, really conservative on that notion, especially about the woman on the workplace. That's the major problem, and the unity of family. So I'm not sure I answered correctly to Laura, but thanks for this question.
Okay, the third question comes from Matthew Chip, who's asking, to what extent what you say about the CTCC adopting human rights as a language is just language, and to what extent it's actually a deeper engagement to make the unions more open? And he's giving the example of gender lines, like what you've just spoken about for Laura's question.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, when I speak about some tension between universalism and the practice, I think that this is a crucial element here. And one of the things is that, yeah, human rights is a discourse. It's an atu. I don't know the words in the word in English.
Asset, I think, an asset,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah. And there's a lot of old claims that are reframed in universal language. But at the same time, I think that for many of activists engaged in human rights in these organizations, but it's also true from student movement and many other in the 50s, the fact that of embracing universal ideals bring many questions. And yeah, and I think that the evolution of the composition of student movement, of unions, has something to do with this kind of tension. But the reality is that if you look at the structures of power inside organization, even in the Ligue des Droits in the 1960s, you have this also the power relation that were still there. So yeah,
Good. So you're doing well there. The people who asked the two first questions said that your answers were very good, so, and very useful. Okay, next question from Sarah, who's asked two. So I'll choose number two, Sarah, because it points in a new direction. Could you say that all what you've described, the engagement with the Catholic unions, with the human rights, the declaration, might have pushed Canada to adopt their own bill? Is there a link between that?
What is, yes, that's a great question. It's but hard to answer. But for example, there's some text about the personalist origin of the Canadian Charter and the role of played by Trudeau, Marchand, Pelletier, and others. Like if there was a French-Canadian file that go through the 1982 Declaration of Human Rights. The fact is that if you look at the debates in 1948, 1950, also about the Declaration of Human Rights, Diefenbaker in 1960, the CTCC and Catholic workers were always behind this, but some kind of retreat, mainly because this kind of declaration does not protect workers' rights. That was the main critic of Declaration of Diefenbaker, but also all the question of constitution and federal and provincial jurisdiction. I know that this was really a crucial thing in the 50s and later for sure. But yeah, I think that human rights movement is kind of bring together people who have different conception of rights, who were engaged in some categorical rights too. So for sure, Catholic organization in Quebec has played a leading role. And Trudeau was one of the founder of the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme in 1963. And then he goes to federal and adopted the 1982 Canadian Charter. So yeah, but it's hard to state that, yeah, there's one organization who pushed out the idea. I think that Jewish labor organization, minority, racialized groups, and also international unions, committees on human rights were really more engaged at the federal level at the time.
Thank you. The next one is from Emmanuel. So he's asking, to what extent was the use of the language of human rights by the unions was effective? Did it actually help them achieve their aim?
That's a really interesting question, because it's always the question that people ask me by saying, okay, but does this, what happened when they use it, does it change something, or is the same thing if they use it other values, ideologies, and arguments and all this. What is sure is that in the context of Duplessis, and I think it's the same thing as many repressive contexts, the more you use human rights, the more you suffer repression. And I think that the organization who had the more power on, for example, provincial government in the 50s, it was people who avoid this language. And I published an article about the Canadian Jewish Congress, who were really conscious about the fact that if they use human rights language in certain circles in Quebec, where the power is, there's going to be a backlash, because there was a lot of this old idea of the Catholicism versus the French Declaration of Human Rights. And Duplessis often state that CTCC were communist. Why? Because they defend human rights. So there was kind of, so I think, but in 1960s with the liberal government, there was really an opening there. So now that's why the coalition arrived in 1963 and not in 1955 or 6. So effectiveness is, I think it depends on the interlocutor. I don't know how to say it.
That's the same in English.
Yeah.
Another transnational question there. Is there, from Johannes, is there any indication that the Quebec history exerted some influence on Vatican II acceptance and recognition of workers' rights as human rights?
That's a hard question, but really interesting, because Vatican, I know that it's really hard to estimate the role played by local activists here in global affairs. I have many times tried to, even at the low International Labor Organization or at the UN. I think this is the same thing for the church. But what is sure is that in Quebec hierarchies, clerical hierarchies, there was many debates about this question of discrimination and human rights. And many top church leaders were starting in 59, 60, 61 to talk really a lot about tolerance and ecumenical relations. There were the first relations between Jews and Catholics in the 40s, but it started beginning in the 60s. So I think what I can answer to this is that there are evolutions that are occurring in Quebec that reflects debates over there. But I haven't looked at which actors from Quebec were present there, so I cannot answer to this question directly. And another last thing about workers' rights, there was a lot of tension in the church in the 1950s. For example, the Archbishop of Montreal, Joseph Charbonneau, took position for asbestos strikers, and this was a really crucial thing. And he was forced to resign and to go to Victoria Island in the West. So, but in the 50s, there were also position about the rights to association, which was considered by the church as the first of human rights. So this kind of, evolution, but I don't know the influence of Quebec church on Vatican.
Okay, now there's an archive question, Paul-Étienne. You spoke about the difficulty of finding information about racial discrimination as we understand it now in the archives of the past, partly because the very word race didn't mean the same thing. And so what do you think are the next steps for scholars to uncover systemic racism against minorities within Quebec within the limitations you have presented? And this question comes from Sami.
That's a really good question, because first, maybe I can say that there's a kind of retard. How you say retard?
A lag, a delay, maybe?
Yeah, kind of delay of what happening in Canada and in many French circles of historians here. And for example, the Institut d'Histoire d'Amérique Française, which is the main historian institute in Quebec, are starting to reflect about the question of diversity and how to include racialized communities in the récit, French-Canadian récit. And I think that the first way to do it is to give to put the voices of ethnic minorities at the center of the place. And there's many sources. So, for example, now I'm looking at the debates about anti-discrimination laws, and I'll go to the archives of the Negro Community Center, Negro Citizenship Association, and I know that they build another. I will try to build another narrative. That's the word I was looking for. The reality is that in many white organizations, for example, at the CTCC, you have this Immigration Hate Service. I don't know how to translate it. And they always talk about the place of racialized groups and racialized person. And we say we have people of all races from all around the world. But when you look at the pictures and when you know who is coming to Canada at the time, it was mainly French, mainly Catholics from Europe. So when they speak about race and racism, it's kind of always hard to manage as a historian. You have to put a kind of a filter with this. But I think that many young historians are trying to kind of change this old nationalist narrative that we are kind of swimming in until we, and I see many things that is quite fun to see in my profession here. Yeah.
Okay, the next question I kept for towards the end because it's a hard one and it's a big one. Do you think that the rights of minorities have improved in Quebec since the time that you are studying?
So you leave it at the end. So I have 30 minutes to. I think one of the major problems, like this tendency of opposing minority rights with collective rights, I was trying to find it in the 50s. And what I see, it's really not the same thing as I see today. I think in that sense, the major shift occurs in 1982 with the repatriation of the Constitution and the inclusion of a Charter of Rights, which is really specific in the world because it includes also linguistic rights. And I think that this kind of create a huge gap between some right wings of the nationalists and the notion of human rights. So you have a lot of text that they state that human rights is an instrument to counter the collective rights of Quebecers, even on the left. And I think that on that point, the frame of the human rights state is really more solid. You have this Commission of Rights, you have this Charter of Rights, but in terms of public discourse, and I can say culture, there's a huge backlash that occurs in 1980s, but also 1990s, and that is kind of getting bigger and bigger in the context that we are living in, and recent debates about secularism and all this. So I think it's worse than in the 50s in terms of mentality. It's kind of hard to state, but I see a real backlash in the recent years that really afraid me and human rights activists in Quebec. Yeah.
Okay, so this is time to thank you, Paul-Étienne. I think that it was, your talk was a demonstration of how historians can bring some nuance and depth to very topical debates. And we wish you all the best for what you're about to do at the University of Toronto to carry on your research for more recent times.